There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, their weight and significance hidden until much later, when you look back and see them for the fault lines they were. They are the quiet beginnings of earthquakes, the imperceptible shift in the wind before a storm. For me, one of those moments was a Tuesday night in October, a night that smelled of rain-soaked asphalt and the lingering scent of the curry Julian had insisted on ordering. He was asleep, his head resting not on a cushion, but in the space between my shoulder and my chest, a place he had claimed without fanfare or permission an hour earlier. His breathing was a slow, even tied against my ribs, a rhythm so profoundly peaceful it felt like a violation of some unspoken law. I was a statue carved from tension, every muscle coiled, my own breath held captive in my lungs. My only job in that moment, was not to move, not to breathe too deeply, not to let the frantic, percussive beat of my heart against his ear wake him up and shatter the fragile architecture of the scene. I had spent years building a fortress around the truth of my feelings for him, a structure of careful friendship, of casual distance, of unspoken rules. And in his sleep, with the simple, unconscious act of seeking comfort, he had walked right through the main gate, past all the guards, and laid down in the castle keep. His phone, lying face down on the cushion beside us, buzzed softly, a muted vibration against the fabric. A text from Sarah, probably. His ex-girlfriend. The reason he was here in the first place, adrift and seeking harbor in my small, quiet apartment. The thought was a splinter of ice in my chest. I was not his destination. I was a port in his storm, a temporary shelter until his own ship was repaired and ready to sail on. It was a role I had accepted, a role I performed with the quiet diligence of a supporting actor who knows he will never get the lead. Yet, the solid, warm weight of him against me was a language my body understood far better than my mind. It spoke of permanence, of belonging, of a rightness that terrified me. His hair, still damp from the earlier drizzle, tickled my chin. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his shampoo, a scent I knew as well as my own. In the 5 years I had known Julian, I had cataloged these small, insignificant details with the precision of a botanist studying a rare flower. The way a single dimple appeared on his left cheek when he was trying not to laugh. The way he ran a hand through his hair when he was frustrated, leaving it standing up in a chaotic, endearing mess. The exact shade of his eyes when the afternoon sun hit them, a complex hazel that held flecks of gold and green. These were the secret, hoarded treasures of my unrequited love, stored away in a vault deep inside me. And now, the source of all that quiet adoration was asleep on me, oblivious. His hand, which had been resting on his own chest, uncurled in his sleep, his fingers brushing against my stomach. A current of heat, sharp and immediate, shot through me. It was nothing, a twitch, an unconscious movement. But in the hyper-vigilant state of my awareness, it felt like a declaration. I stared at the far wall of my living room, at the series of black and white photographs I had framed there. A lonely pier stretching into a foggy sea. The intricate frost patterns on a window pane. A single, empty chair in a sunlit room. They were studies in solitude, in the beauty of quiet spaces. My life was a quiet space. I had curated it that way. It was safe, predictable. And Julian, with his boundless energy, his easy laughter, and his chaotic emotional wake, was the one beautiful, unpredictable variable I allowed inside. He was the flash of color in my monochrome world. Having him here like this, so intimately close, was like holding a live flame in my cupped hands. It was beautiful. It was mesmerizing. And I knew, with a certainty that ached in my bones, that I was going to get burned. But for now, in the stillness of the room, with the sound of his breathing as the only anchor, I did not move. I just held the flame and prayed it wouldn't go out. Our friendship began, as many do in college, out of proximity and a shared sense of being slightly out of sync with our surroundings. I was a quiet art student, more comfortable behind the lens of my camera than in the boisterous, crowded lecture halls. My world was one of light and shadow, of composition and quiet observation. I saw life in frames, in meticulously composed moments that held a silent story. Julian was studying software engineering, a world of logic and code, of concrete problems and elegant solutions. He was not loud, Not in the way of the fraternity brothers who dominated the campus social scene, but he possessed a vibrant, restless energy that drew people to him. He was like a human sun, radiating a warmth and confidence that I, a creature of the shade, found both intimidating and deeply compelling. We were assigned as partners for a mandatory interdisciplinary project, a task that filled me with a familiar, low-grade dread. The Humanities and STEM Collaborative Initiative, they called it. I called it a forced social interaction. I remember our first meeting in the library. He arrived 10 minutes late, hair a mess, a sheepish grin on his face, and 2 coffees in his hands. "Leo? I'm Julian," he'd said, pushing one of the cups across the table toward me. "Sorry I'm late. My alarm and I are in a passive-aggressive standoff." The apology was delivered with such disarming charm that my carefully constructed wall of introverted reservation began to crumble almost immediately. I had expected him to be dismissive of my soft discipline, to treat the project as a box to be ticked. Instead, he was curious, genuinely curious. He asked me about my photography, about what I was trying to capture, not just what I was seeing. He listened, really listened, with an intensity that made me feel, for the first time in a long time, truly seen. He didn't just look at my photos, he stepped inside them. "It's like you're capturing the feeling of a place, not just the place itself," he'd mused, looking at a photo I'd taken of an empty swing set at dusk. "It's lonely, but it's peaceful lonely. Does that make sense?" It made perfect sense. He had, in a single sentence, articulated the very essence of what I was trying to achieve, a concept I often struggled to explain to my own professors. In that moment, something inside me shifted. It was the beginning of the quiet click of recognition, the feeling of finding a piece of yourself in another person. Over the course of that semester, our project meetings bled into study sessions, which bled into late-night conversations about everything and nothing. We talked about code and composition, about algorithms and aesthetics. He would try to explain the beauty of a perfectly efficient line of code, and I would try to explain the emotional weight of a particular shade of gray. We were translators for each other, decoding the languages of our separate worlds. It was during one of those late nights, sprawled on the worn carpet of my dorm room floor, surrounded by textbooks and empty pizza boxes, that I first met Sarah. She'd appeared in the doorway, a phantom I hadn't known existed. "Jules, you coming?" she'd asked, her voice soft. Julian had scrambled to his feet, a blush creeping up his neck. "Hey, yeah, in a sec. Sarah, this is Leo." Leo, my girlfriend. Sarah, the word girlfriend landed in the air between us with the finality of a slammed door. I had felt a strange, hollow sensation in my stomach, a feeling I couldn't name at the time. I smiled, said hello, and watched as he gathered his things, his movements suddenly hurried. He'd left with her, and the room, which had been buzzing with his energy just moments before, felt suddenly vast and silent. It was only then, in the echoing quiet, that I identified the hollow feeling. It was disappointment, a profound, sinking disappointment that I had no right to feel. That was the beginning of my education in loving Julian from a distance. Sarah was a constant, a gentle and kind presence in his life. I liked her, which made it all the more complicated. There was no villain in this story, only a quiet ache in my own chest. I learned to compartmentalize. There was Julian, my best friend, the person I could talk to for hours, the one who understood the silent language of my photographs. And then there was the other Julian, the one I watched from afar, the one who held Sarah's hand, the one whose life had a shape that did not include me in the way I secretly, desperately, wanted. I became an expert in the art of subtle self-censorship. I learned how to turn the volume down on the flutter in my stomach when he'd throw an arm around my shoulders. I learned how to smile genuinely when he talked about his future with her. I perfected the role of the supportive, platonic friend, a performance so convincing that I sometimes almost believed it myself. Our friendship solidified after college. We moved to the same city, a sprawling metropolis where having a familiar anchor was a necessity. He got a high-paying job at a tech firm, and I carved out a niche for myself as a freelance photographer, shooting portraits and quiet cityscapes. My apartment, a small one-bedroom with good natural light, became our neutral ground. It was the place he came to escape the pressures of his job, the place I came to escape the solitude of my own head. We built a friendship that was deep and true, a structure I treasured more than anything. It was a house I lived in, and the secret of my love for him was a single, locked room in the basement. I never went in there when he was around. I never even glanced at the door. The risk of him ever finding the key, of him seeing what was inside, was too great. I would rather have him as a friend for the rest of my life than risk losing him entirely over a truth he hadn't asked for and likely didn't want. So I kept the door locked, and I learned to live in the rest of the house. The earthquake that finally shook that house to its foundations came not as a sudden cataclysm, but as a quiet, late-night phone call. It was a Wednesday. I was in my darkroom, the red safe light casting an eerie glow over the trays of chemicals. My phone, which I usually kept on silent, buzzed insistently from the corner where I'd left it. I ignored it at first, my hands submerged in the developer, watching an image slowly emerge on the paper like a ghost materializing. But it buzzed again, and then again. A prickle of unease went through me. Julian rarely called this late unless it was important. Wiping my hands, I answered it. "Hello, Leo." His voice was thick, broken. It was a sound I had never heard before. Julian's voice was always so full of life, so clear. This was a frayed, waterlogged version of it. Can I come over?" There was no hesitation. "Of course. Are you okay?" A choked, wet sound came through the receiver. "No, not really. Sarah and we broke up." The words hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. Julian and Sarah. They were a constant, a fixed point in my universe. They had been together for 7 years. They had a shared apartment, a shared cat, a shared life that seemed as solid and dependable as a mountain range. The thought of them breaking up was like imagining the mountains themselves crumbling into dust. "I'm on my way," I said, my mind already calculating the fastest route, the potential traffic. "No," he said quickly. "No, I'm already in the car. I'll be there in 20-inch. When I opened the door 20 minutes later, he looked like a shipwreck. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, his clothes were rumpled, and he held a single, beat-up duffel bag in his hand. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, stripped of his usual vibrant energy, as if someone had unplugged him from his power source. He didn't say anything. He just stepped inside when I moved aside, walked into the middle of my living room, and stood there, looking lost. I closed the door, the sound echoing in the silence. The locked room in the basement of my heart rattled, a tremor of forbidden, inappropriate hope mixing with a genuine, overwhelming wave of sympathy for my friend's pain. I pushed the hope down, viciously. This was not about me. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked softly, keeping my distance. He shook his head, a jerky, tight movement. He dropped the duffel bag to the floor. "Not yet. Can I just sit here for a while?" "You can stay as long as you need," I told him, and I meant it. "The couch is yours." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were swimming with a pain so raw it was hard to look at directly. It was like staring into the sun. "Thanks, Leo," he whispered. The words were barely audible. He sank onto my couch, the one he was currently asleep on in my memory, and buried his face in his hands. His shoulders began to shake with silent, racking sobs. I had never seen Julian cry, not once in 5 years. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my hands clenched at my sides. Every instinct screamed at me to go to him, to put a hand on his back, to offer some physical comfort. But I couldn't. The line between friend and something more had always been so sharply defined in my mind, policed by the ever-present reality of Sarah. Now, with her gone, the line was blurred, indistinct. To touch him now felt like a transgression, like taking advantage of his grief. So I stayed where I was, a silent sentinel in his storm, and let him cry. It was the beginning of the shift, the first sign that the ground beneath our feet was no longer stable. That first night set the tone for the weeks that followed. Julian stayed on my couch, a temporary refugee from the ruins of his own life. He was a ghost haunting my apartment, moving through the rooms with a listless, hollowed-out energy. He'd spend hours staring at his phone, then hours staring at nothing at all. He barely ate. He spoke in clipped, monosyllabic sentences. My role was simple, to be present. I made him food he didn't eat. I put on movies he didn't watch. I maintained the space around him, keeping it quiet and calm, a low-stimulus environment for his wounded spirit to rest. I became a student of his grief, observing its rhythms, its ebbs and flows. I learned the difference between his tired silences and his angry silences, between the sadness that made him retreat into himself and the sadness that made him restless and agitated. Then, the text began. It started innocuously. He was at work, trying to navigate the minefield of sympathetic colleagues and the sheer difficulty of focusing on complex code when his personal life was in shambles. "This day is a nightmare." A message would pop up on my screen. I'd reply with something simple, supportive. "Just a few more hours. You've got this," or I'd send him a photo I'd just taken. A particularly interesting shadow, a dog looking ridiculous in a sweater, anything to offer a momentary distraction. Slowly, the frequency increased. It became a constant, running conversation that stitched our days together. He'd text me good morning before he even got out of bed on my couch. "Morning. Is there coffee?" And I'd text him good night from my bedroom, long after he'd fallen into a fitful sleep in the living room. "Hope you sleep well. Let me know if you need anything." These were not the kinds of texts we used to send. Our previous communications had been logistical, functional. "Running late. Want to grab dinner Friday? Check out this funny link." This was different. This was a lifeline. He was checking in, but he was also checking on me. "Did you eat lunch?" He'd text in the middle of the afternoon, knowing I often forgot when I was deep in an editing session. "Don't work too late." He'd send around 7, an echo of a conversation we'd had 100 times. It was a subtle shift, but a profound one. He, in the midst of his own crisis, was carving out space in his mind for me. It felt like he was weaving a digital thread between us, a connection that existed even when we were miles apart. I found myself waiting for his messages, the small buzz of my phone becoming a focal point of my day. Each one was a small, warm stone dropped into the cool, still pond of my loneliness. This new, constant communication began to bleed into our evenings. The ritual was born from it. He'd come home to my apartment from work, exhausted and drained. I'd have dinner ready, or we'd order something. We'd sit on the couch, not talking much at first, and he'd scroll through his phone while I read a book or sorted through the day's photos on my laptop. Then, one of us would suggest a movie. It was a pretense, a way to fill the silence that was sometimes too heavy to bear. We'd turn off the lights, and the flickering screen would provide a shared focus, a distraction from the raw, unspoken emotions in the room. In the beginning, there was a careful, deliberate space between us on the couch. A whole cushion's worth of neutral territory. It was a border I policed vigilantly. But the border began to erode, slowly, then all at once. It started with his foot. He'd be stretched out, and his socked foot would come to rest against my calf. The first time it happened, my entire nervous system went on high alert. It was a casual, meaningless contact, but it felt like a brand. I didn't move. I didn't acknowledge it. And because I didn't pull away, it happened again the next night. Then, a few nights later, he fell asleep during the movie. His head, which had been propped up on the armrest, slumped sideways, coming to rest on my shoulder. My heart hammered against my ribs. He was so close. I could feel the warmth of his skin through my shirt, smell the faint scent of his cologne. I sat there, rigid, for the entire 2-hour film, my arm going numb beneath his weight. When the credits rolled, I gently shook him awake. "Hey, movie's over." He'd blinked, disoriented, then pulled back quickly, a flush of embarrassment on his face. "Oh man. Sorry. I was exhausted." "It's fine," I'd said, my voice sounding impossibly casual. "You were tired." But it wasn't fine. It had cracked something open in me, a longing so fierce it was dizzying. And it kept happening. The couch, which had once felt so large, seemed to shrink each night. The neutral territory disappeared. He would lean against me almost immediately, not with the accidental slump of sleep, but with a quiet, deliberate intention. It was a silent request for comfort, for solid ground. My shoulder became his pillow. My side became his anchor. He would fall asleep tucked against me, his breathing evening out into that slow, steady rhythm that both soothed and electrified me. I never said a word. I never acknowledged the change. I was terrified that if I named it, if I pointed to it, it would vanish. It existed in a fragile, liminal space of plausible deniability. He was grieving. He was tired. He needed a friend. I was just a friend, providing a stable surface for him to lean on. That was the story I told myself, a flimsy narrative I clung to as the physical intimacy escalated. The ritual extended beyond the couch. He started staying in my spare room, a small space I used mostly for storage. I cleared it out for him, put fresh sheets on the bed. You can't sleep on the couch forever, I told him. You need a real bed. He'd been grateful, but a strange thing started happening. He'd go to his room at the end of the night, and I'd go to mine. But he'd leave his door ajar. Just a crack. A sliver of light from the hallway would cut across his floor. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it felt significant. It felt like an invitation, or at least a negation of being closed off. It was a signal that he wasn't sealed away in his own grief. It said, I'm here. You're there. But the space between us is not entirely closed. I would lie in my own bed, staring at my own closed door, acutely aware of that sliver of light down the hall. I would listen for the sound of his breathing, for the rustle of sheets as he turned in his sleep. My apartment, once my solitary sanctuary, was now a shared space, charged with a new and terrifying intimacy. The air itself felt different, thick with unspoken questions. This went on for weeks, a slow, agonizing, beautiful dance of approach and retreat. He was leaning on me, physically and emotionally, more than he ever had with anyone, including, I suspected, Sarah. He was texting me more than he was texting anyone else. I had become the primary contact, the emergency number, the first and last person he spoke to each day. For someone who had spent years loving him in secret, this new proximity was both a dream come true and a unique form of torture. I was getting everything I had ever wanted, but it was all under the guise of friendship. It was a feast I couldn't eat, a fire I couldn't get warm from. I was constantly analyzing, decoding. Did that touch mean something? Did the way he looked at me just now hold a deeper meaning? Or was I just projecting my own desperate hope onto the blank canvas of his grief? I was a detective searching for clues in a case where I was the only suspect, the only one who believed a crime of the heart was even being committed. The night he fell asleep on my chest, the night that replayed in my mind over and over, was the culmination of this ritual. It was the moment the plausible deniability wore so thin it was transparent. He hadn't just leaned on me. He had curled into me. He had sought out the core of my warmth, the beat of my heart, and made it his anchor. And I had let him. I had sat there in the dark, a human harbor, and let his ship come into port, all the while knowing a tide would eventually come and pull him back out to sea. The crossing happened on a Thursday. It had been a particularly brutal day for him. His name was still on the lease of the apartment he had shared with Sarah, and he'd had to go there with her to sort out the final logistics of their separation. He had to divide the life they had built together into two neat piles, mine and yours. He came back to my place that evening looking like he'd been through a war. The hollowed-out look was back in his eyes, deeper this time. He didn't speak when he came in. He just dropped his keys on the small table by the door and walked to the couch, sinking into it as if his bones had turned to liquid. I had been making tea, and I brought a mug over to him, placing it on the coffee table. He didn't seem to notice. Tough day? I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He let out a short, bitter laugh that was more of a cough. You have no idea, he said, his voice raw. He finally looked up at me, and his gaze was desperate. We had this stupid ceramic bird. It was ugly. I hated it. She bought it at some flea market our first year together. And we spent 10 minutes arguing over who had to take it. 10 minutes. Over a stupid, ugly bird. Because neither of us wanted the memory of it. He shook his head, looking down at his hands. How does it come to that, Leo? 7 years. And it ends with an argument over who gets stuck with the ugly bird. I didn't have an answer. I just sat down on the couch, leaving the customary cushion of space between us, though it felt foolish and formal now. We sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the quiet hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. The sky outside the window deepened from gray to indigo. I didn't suggest a movie. The pretense felt too flimsy tonight. He needed silence. He needed space to just be. Or so I thought. After what felt like an eternity, he shifted, turning his body slightly toward me. Can I ask you something? He said, his voice low. Anything. He hesitated, seeming to search for the right words. All this time, you haven't pushed. You haven't asked a million questions. You just let me be here. He looked at me, his eyes shining in the dim light. Why? The question caught me off guard. I thought for a moment, trying to formulate an honest answer that wouldn't betray the whole truth. Because it looked like what you needed, I said finally. You didn't need a therapist. You just needed a quiet room. A place to fall apart where no one would try to glue you back together too fast. A single tear traced a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just kept looking at me. Everyone else wants to fix it, he whispered. My mom, my sister, our friends. They all have advice. Get back out there. It's for the best. You'll find someone else. It's like they're all trying to pave over the hole. You're the only one who's just. Sat with me at the edge of it. My throat felt tight. It's a big hole, I said. It deserves some respect. He let out a shaky breath, a sound that was half sob, half laugh. He closed the space between us then, not by leaning, but by moving his entire body over until his knee was pressed against mine, his shoulder flush against my own. He rested his head on my shoulder, just as he had done so many times before. But this time was different. This wasn't the passive slump of exhaustion. This was an active choice, a deliberate move toward me. I rested my head against his, a gesture I had never dared to make before. We sat like that for a few minutes, two broken shapes leaning against each other, forming a single, stronger one. The air was thick with everything we weren't saying. It was electric. Then, he lifted his head. He pulled back just enough to look at me. His face was inches from mine. His eyes searched my face, a desperate, questioning look in them. My heart was no longer beating. It was detonating, a series of silent explosions in my chest. This was it. This was the moment where the path diverges, where you have to choose a road, and you can never go back. He was waiting. He was asking for something, and I didn't know what it was. Permission? Reassurance? A sign. His gaze dropped to my lips, then back to my eyes. The movement was so small, so fleeting, but I saw it. I saw it, and the world tilted on its axis. Leo, he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. Would it be okay if I? He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The question hung in the air between us, fragile and shimmering. It was the most terrifying and beautiful question I had ever heard. My entire future seemed to balance on the point of my answer. The locked room in the basement of my heart burst open, its contents flooding every part of me. All the years of carefully guarded feelings, all the quiet pining, all the hopeless longing. It was all there, in my eyes, on my face. I couldn't hide it, not anymore. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. I just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the permission he needed. He leaned in, slowly, tentatively, giving me every possible chance to pull away, to turn my head, to say no. I didn't move. I stayed right where I was, meeting him halfway. And then his lips met mine. It wasn't a passionate, movie-style kiss. It was hesitant. It was soft. It was unbelievably gentle. It was a question and a confession and an apology all at once. It was just the barest pressure, a moment of warmth and shocking softness. It lasted for only a second, maybe two, and then he pulled back, his eyes wide, searching my face for a reaction. I could feel his breath on my skin. I was no longer breathing at all. The world had gone silent. The only thing that existed was his face, his eyes, the ghost of his lips on mine. And in the depths of his gaze, I saw something I had never seen before. Not just pain and confusion, but a mirror of my own terrifying, hopeful vulnerability. The silence that followed the kiss was heavier than any we had ever shared. It was a dense, suffocating thing, filled with the fallout of a boundary crossed. Julian pulled back completely, moving to the far end of the couch as if he'd been burned. He wouldn't look at me. He just stared at his hands, which were clenched into tight fists in his lap. The space he created between us felt like a canyon, a vast, unbridgeable chasm where just moments before there had been none. The warmth of the contact was already fading from my lips, replaced by a creeping, icy dread. I had misinterpreted everything. I had let my own hope build a narrative that had no basis in his reality. He was grieving. He was lost. And in a moment of profound vulnerability, he had reached for the closest source of comfort in a way he didn't understand and now deeply regretted. I was the ugly ceramic bird. I was the unwanted memory he would now have to figure out what to do with. Julian, I started, my voice a dry rasp. Don't, he cut me off, his voice sharp. He still wouldn't look at me. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. I'm so sorry, Leo. He finally risked a glance at me, and his face was a mask of panic and self-loathing. I'm so messed up right now. With Sarah, with everything. I don't want to ruin this. Our friendship. It's the only thing that's felt real for weeks. He stood up abruptly, pacing the small space in front of the couch like a caged animal. God, I'm such an idiot. Every word was a hammer blow. He was erasing it. He was frantically trying to shove what had just happened back into the box, to label it as a mistake, an anomaly, a symptom of his grief. He wasn't seeing me at all. I was just collateral damage in the explosion of his previous relationship. A wave of something cold and hard washed over me, displacing the hurt. It was anger, a quiet, deep anger. Not at him, not really, but at the situation, at my own foolishness, at the years I had spent being so careful, only to have the wall breached by an act that, to him, meant nothing more than a moment of confusion. I'm going to. I think I should go, he said, running a hand through his hair in that familiar, frustrated gesture. I'll just grab my stuff. Go where, Julian? I asked, my voice flat. It's after midnight. You have nowhere to go. I'll get a hotel. I don't know. I can't be here right now. He was already moving toward the spare room, toward his duffel bag, his escape. Something inside me snapped. The quiet observer, the patient friend, the silent keeper of secrets, he was gone. In his place was someone I barely recognized, someone who was no longer willing to be a passive feature in the landscape of Julian's life. No, I said, my voice ringing out with a firmness that made him stop in his tracks. He turned around slowly, his eyes wide with surprise. I stood up to face him. You don't get to do that. Do what? He asked, genuinely confused. You don't get to walk into my life, turn it completely upside down, lean on me, sleep on me, text me every single day, make me the center of your entire support system, and then kiss me, and then call it a mistake and try to run away. I said, the words tumbling out, quiet but intense. You don't get to use my friendship as a bandage and then rip it off because you're scared of the wound underneath. The anger was making me shake. For weeks, you have been closing the space between us. In every way, but with words. And tonight, you used words. You asked. And I answered. And now you're telling me it was all just a symptom? That it had nothing to do with me. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. The panic in his eyes was slowly being replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. He was finally seeing it. Not just the kiss, but the entire context it was built on. He was seeing the weeks of intimacy, the constant contact, the deep emotional reliance, not from his perspective of need, but from mine. He was seeing it as a pattern, as a progression. Leo, he started, his voice failing him. I never meant to hurt you. I know you didn't, I said, the anger beginning to subside, leaving a vast, aching sadness in its wake. That's the problem. You don't even know what you're doing. You're just moving toward warmth because you're cold. But you have to understand, you can't treat a person like a fireplace. You can't just take the heat and then walk away when you feel a little warmer, complaining that you got too close to the flame. The metaphor hung in the air, raw and exposed. I felt stripped bare, as if I had just confessed everything. In a way, I had. He sank back down onto the arm of the couch, his face pale. He looked utterly defeated. What do you want me to say? He whispered. The question was honest. He was lost. He truly didn't know. I took a deep breath, trying to find my own way back to solid ground. I want you to be honest, I said, my voice quiet again. Not with me. With yourself. And then, maybe, with me. I want you to stop running from whatever it is you're feeling and actually look at it. And I want you to stop apologizing for kissing me. It was the most honest thing you've done in a month. My last sentence seemed to land with physical force. He flinched, then looked up at me, his eyes filled with a new, terrifying level of confusion. The idea that the kiss was honesty, not a mistake, was a variable his logical, engineering mind hadn't computed. It broke his equation. I can't, he choked out. I don't know how. Then stay. I said, the word a plea and a command. Don't go to a hotel. Go to your room. Close the door. And in the morning, we can pretend none of this ever happened, if that's what you need. We can go back to being friends. But you are not running out of this apartment tonight. It was a gamble. I was offering him an out, a return to the safety of our old dynamic, but on my terms. I was taking back control of my space, of my own heart. He stared at me for a long, silent moment. I could practically see the war raging inside him. The instinct to flee was powerful, but my words, my quiet ultimatum, had anchored him. Finally, he gave a slow, defeated nod. He didn't say goodnight. He just stood up, walked to the spare room, and I heard the door click shut. Not left ajar. Shut. The finality of the sound was a fresh kind of pain. I had won the battle, but I was sure I had just lost the war. I sank onto the couch, the place where he had kissed me, and for the first time since his crisis began, I was the one who felt completely and utterly alone in my own home. The next few days were an exercise in excruciating politeness. The easy intimacy we had built was gone, replaced by a stilted, awkward distance. The air in the apartment was thick with the memory of that conversation, of that kiss. We moved around each other like strangers who had been forced to share a room. The constant stream of texts ceased. The silence on my phone was deafening. He'd leave for work before I was fully awake, and he'd come home late, retreating to his room with a mumbled "hey" and the quiet click of his door shutting. The door was always shut now. That small, symbolic change hurt more than I could have imagined. It was a physical manifestation of the wall he had rebuilt between us, higher and thicker than before. I gave him the space he was so clearly demanding. I didn't push. I didn't ask questions. I retreated back into my own world, into my work. I spent hours in my darkroom, the scent of chemicals of familiar comfort. I tried to lose myself in the process, in the magic of watching an image appear from nothing. But his ghost was everywhere. I'd see his abandoned coffee mug on the counter. I'd find a stray sock of his under the couch. My apartment, my sanctuary, was now a minefield of memories of a closeness I had briefly been allowed to have. I felt a profound sense of loss, a grief for a relationship that had never even been real. I had been so angry at him for his confusion, but now, in the cold light of his withdrawal, I just felt a deep, hollow ache. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was better to go back to being just friends, even a damaged version of it, than to have nothing at all. The breaking point came on a Sunday afternoon, nearly a week after the kiss. I was at my desk, editing photos from a recent shoot, when he appeared in the doorway of my office. I hadn't even heard him leave his room. He just stood there, looking hesitant, his hands shoved into the pockets of his sweatpants. "Can we talk?" he asked. His voice was quiet, uncertain. I swiveled in my chair to face him, my heart giving a nervous lurch. Okay. He didn't come in. He just leaned against the doorframe, as if he needed the support. He looked tired. More than tired. He looked worn down to the bone. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he started, his eyes fixed on a spot on the floor. "About what you said. About everything." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "You were right. I was being a coward. I was running. I waited, not daring to speak, not daring to hope. When Sarah and I ended things," he continued, his voice gaining a little more strength, "it felt like my whole world fell apart. Everything I thought was solid, everything I had planned. It was all just gone. And I was terrified, not just of being alone, but of who I was without her. I didn't even know." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were raw with a painful honesty. "And then there was you. You were solid. You were quiet, and you were kind, and you were just there. And being here, with you, it was the only thing that felt safe. The only thing that made sense." He paused, and I could see him struggling to articulate the next part. I told myself that's all it was, that I was just leaning on my best friend. But that night, when I was telling you about the stupid bird, I was looking at you, and you were listening, and you understood. You didn't try to fix it. You just understood the sadness of it. And I had this thought. It was so clear. It was, this is what home feels like. My breath caught in my throat. He had felt it too, the rightness of it. "And that thought scared the hell out of me," he whispered, "because it wasn't supposed to feel like that. Not with you. You're my best friend. You're a guy?" It didn't fit into any box in my head that I knew how to label. It was impossible. So when I kissed you, it was like, I don't know. It was like I had to know. I had to see if the feeling was real. And it was. For that 1 second, it was so real he shook his head, a look of profound confusion on his face. And then my brain just short-circuited. All the alarms went off. "This is wrong. You're confused. You're going to lose him," so I panicked. "And I hurt you. And I am so sorry for that, Leo. More than I can say." He had finally said it all. He had laid all his broken, contradictory feelings out on the table. The relief I felt was so immense it was dizzying. I wasn't crazy. I hadn't imagined it. The connection was real, for him too. It was just tangled up in fear and a lifetime of conditioned expectations. I stood up and walked over to him, stopping a few feet away. "Thank you for telling me that," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "That's all I needed to hear." "No, it's not," he said, pushing himself off the doorframe. He took a tentative step toward me, closing some of the distance between us. "What I've been trying to figure out all week, hiding in my room like a child, is what happens now. And I don't have an answer. I'm still scared, and I'm still confused. But there's one thing I'm not confused about anymore." He was standing right in front of me now, so close I could see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes. "I don't want to go back," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "to how we were before. That friendship, it was great, but it wasn't this. And I don't want to lose this, even if I don't know what it is yet. I would rather be confused and scared with you than go back to feeling safe and certain without you." It was the bravest thing he had ever said. He was choosing uncertainty. He was choosing the terrifying, unnamed space we had created. He was choosing me, in all his confusion. The last of my anger, the last of my hurt, dissolved, leaving only a profound, tender affection. "Okay," I whispered back. "Okay, we can be confused and scared together." A watery, relieved smile broke through the tension on his face. It was the first real smile I had seen from him in a week. Yeah, I confirmed, a smile of my own finally emerging. I reached out, my hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before I rested it on his arm. His skin was warm, solid, real. He didn't pull away. Instead, he covered my hand with his own. And we just stood there for a long moment, in the doorway of my office, a silent agreement passing between us. We didn't have a map. We didn't know the name of the country we were in. But for the first time, we had agreed to explore it together. The days that followed were a new kind of quiet. The awkwardness was gone, but in its place was a careful, tender intentionality. We were learning a new language, a new way of being with each other. The physical boundary was gone, but we didn't rush to demolish it. Instead, we rebuilt it, slowly, deliberately, together. The couch ritual returned, but it was different now. When he leaned against me, it wasn't a desperate grasp for comfort, and it wasn't a tentative test of a boundary. It was a choice, a statement. "I am here. I choose to be here, with you." I could lean back, my arm around his shoulders, and it wasn't a secret act of longing, but a mutual gesture of affection. There was no more plausible deniability. There was only a quiet, unfolding truth. We talked. We really talked, not just about his breakup or my work, but about us. About his fear, about my years of silence. He asked me, one night, how long I had felt that way about him. I told him the truth. A long time, I'd said. Maybe since that first semester, in the library, he had been quiet for a long time after that, processing the weight of it. He hadn't been apologetic, but humbled. "All that time," he'd whispered, "I had no idea. You were so good at being my friend," I'd replied. "I was your friend." That part was always real, and it was. The love didn't negate the friendship. It had grown out of it, a deep-root system that had finally, unexpectedly, broken through the surface. The door to his room started staying ajar again. But now, the sliver of light felt different. It was no longer a symbol of an unclosed wound, but a quiet invitation. An acknowledgement of the connection that ran between our two separate rooms. One night, after a particularly long day, I found myself standing outside that open door. I could hear the soft sound of his breathing inside. I raised my hand to knock, then hesitated. But the memory of his confession, of his choice to be scared with me, gave me courage. I knocked softly. "Yeah," his sleepy voice called out. I pushed the door open a little wider. He was lying in bed, reading on his phone. He looked up, a questioning look on his face. "Everything okay?" I stood in the doorway, my heart thumping a slow, steady rhythm. "I just didn't want to be in my room alone," I said, the confession feeling both monumental and incredibly simple. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he moved over, lifting the edge of the comforter. It was a silent, unambiguous invitation. I walked into the room, closed the door behind me, and slid into the bed beside him. We lay there on our backs, side by side, not touching, just staring up at the ceiling. The space between us was charged, but it wasn't anxious. It was filled with a quiet, humming potential. "Is this okay?" I asked, my voice a whisper in the dark room. He turned his head on the pillow to look at me. "Leo," he said, his voice soft and sure in a way I was still getting used to. "With you. I think everything is going to be okay." He reached across the small space between us and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. His hand was warm and strong. It felt like an anchor. It felt like home. We didn't kiss that night. We just lay there, holding hands in the dark, listening to the sound of each other's breathing. There was no need to rush. We had finally found our way out of the storm and into a quiet harbor. The journey ahead was still unknown, the waters uncharted, but we were in the same boat now, holding hands, navigating it together. The old landscape of our friendship had been irrevocably altered, the tectonic plates had shifted, and a new geography had been formed. It was a landscape I did not yet know by heart, but I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that it was a place where I belonged. We began to heal, not in the loud clamor of grand romantic gestures, but in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. And in that silence, we found everything we needed.